What's up everybody, I am Jesse, or GameOverJesse as some of you all may know me, and here with me is a very special guest to talk about something very interesting that I just came across yesterday, and I assume not a lot of people have. Here with me to discuss it is Daniel, our co-host for the podcast, and
Hello.
Tony from Hard4Games. Tony, go ahead and introduce yourself for those who may not know who you are.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me, and as you said, my name is Tony. I run a YouTube channel named Hard4Games, believe it or not. And our channel takes a deep dive into Zelda and Nintendo's history and development stuff and all that good stuff that we're going to talk about today.
Yes. So the topic of this discussion, I was doing a little bit of research because Tony and I, we recently had an interview about his YouTube channel, and during that we started talking about Zelda and the beta for Zelda 64, and it got me interested in Zelda again, so I started looking up some stuff, and I came across a rabbit hole where I just, kept on diving deeper, and I finally got to a website that linked to an archive of Nintendo.com from 1997. So all of this comes from Nintendo themselves. This isn't like a secondhand source that someone heard that was supposed to happen. This is all from Nintendo as far as we can tell, right?
As far as we can tell.
Yes. So this would be, I don't know if this would have been tied into the story of Zelda or if it was just the original story for Ocarina of Time, but there are quite a few changes that could have made the game very different, especially with the use of some items from Ocarina of Time, from the beta that we have here to what we actually got in the end. Now, this website comes from 1997, which was just 1 year before the actual release. So there must have been a lot of changes from this to what the actual game story shows us. And I assume a lot of that came from the game just releasing as a standalone game as opposed to having all of the side content that would have been Zelda, right? Do you think that's why these changes came? Because they had to kind of file it down so it makes sense on its own as a standalone game as opposed to having the extra content from Zelda? Like, do you know anything about that, Tony? Because you on Hard4Games, you all specialize in like digging through and finding all of this beta information, right?
Yeah, well, I can give you my hunch here. So the original Ocarina of Time on a blue disc, or rather on an N64 DD disc, they were blue in development, would have had a total of 512 megabits. Now, at the bottom of this page here that we're looking at, it says 256 megabits. So they are already talking about the game as a cartridge in this particular case. So I question whether it has anything to do with Zelda or Zelda. Maybe it does. Maybe it's a story that Nintendo of Japan gave them that they were still running with after it had switched to cartridge. But my hunch here is that it was the original story, but they just trimmed the fat a little bit in this case.
All right.
That would be my best guess. Possibly related to but maybe not. I don't know.
All right. So we will. We'll have this on the screen for people to read along with, but really quickly we'll try to read through this so everyone can kind of catch up with the story. And there's a lot of screenshots on the actual website that linked me to this old Nintendo archive. So at the top of it, it doesn't even say Ocarina of Time as the title, it just titles it as Zelda 64. Now remember, this was 1 year before the game actually released, so they didn't have a lot of time between this article coming out and the actual release of the game. So it says, prepare to journey once again to Hyrule, land of the ancestors of the gods, and Zelda 64, as Zelda 64 gets closer to release this winter in Japan. So they must have delayed it from this point on, because it says this year in Japan.
I can't remember exactly when it came out in Japan, but it is a Zelda tradition to delay the game, so I would not be shocked.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Alright, so it continues. Additional details about the game's setting and storyline are being revealed by the game's developers. Even though Zelda 64's story is set in the misty past, players will once again take on the mantle of the young hero Link. As the story begins, Link is preparing for his coming-of-age ceremony, which Daniel pointed out before that sounds a lot like Wind Waker, where it's his coming-of-age, he gets his typical green hero garb, but continuing, in which he will receive his guardian spirit. I assume that is a reference to the fairy. In the tradition of his people, children receive a fairy... Yes, okay, so I was right there. Alright.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Children receive a fairy from the fairy tree when they reach adulthood. This fairy becomes a person's lifelong familiar. The fairy accompanies the youthful adventurer seeking his or her fortune in the maze-like forest or in the lands beyond. Link's ceremony, however, is not destined to be a happy one. The fairy tree, source of the guardian spirits, is captured by a strange creature from the depths of the forest. Link is able to locate his guardian spirit, Navi, spelled a little bit different, but that could be some translation stuff. And with your help, slay the creature. However, in the process, the fairy tree is grievously damaged, as it... I'm getting tongue-tied here. Sorry, guys.
Okay.
As its life force ebbs, the fairy tree speaks the words that will shape Link's destiny. Do not allow the thief, Ganondorf, to claim the Triforce. The tree mystically communicates, "O brave one, you must take this sacred stone to a wise man." Ganondorf was infamous throughout the land for his evil practices as the king of thieves. He lusted for the power of the Triforce and searched throughout Hyrule for its resting place, most recently plunging into the forests of Link's people. Link knew he was in grave danger should Ganondorf find him. He took the sacred stone from the fairy tree and set out for Hyrule Castle, the capital of the Hyrulean people. Upon entering the castle, Link is welcomed by the young Princess Zelda, a woman of the Hyrulean royal family, about the same age as he. She is well aware of the crisis facing the land of Hyrule. Zelda relates further details about the Triforce's hidden place, telling Link that he needs to find the 3 sacred stones that fit into a magical ocarina, which serves as the key to a hidden realm. Link's race with the evil Ganondorf to find the sacred stones and the hiding place of the Triforce is on. Zelda 64 tells the story of an earlier age of Hyrule, when Ganon was merely known as the King of Thieves and not the powerful creature of evil he becomes in the other Legend of Zelda adventures. In this role-playing game, the story unfolds in a realistic 3D world. The depth of the backgrounds, the dramatic camera angles, and the realistic objects and animations all combine to create one of the most immersive gaming experiences ever. Although the gameplay has been designed so that anyone can enjoy it, the adventure will not be without its challenges. Great battles will reward the courageous. The fairy, Navi, will accompany you on your journey, providing hints, warning you of enemy attacks, and helping you search for items. While a North American release date has not been announced, the game is targeted to be released in Japan by the end of 1997. Zelda 64 will be a 256 megabit cartridge. So, a lot of information there. What are your initial thoughts on this, guys?
Who did you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Let's start with Tony here, since he's our special guest, because there's a lot of stuff here that is a lot different. And then some of the screenshots that it's showing, it has the wind medallion or the forest medallion as an equipable item. It says Link gets his fairy as a coming of age thing. So I guess in this version you would have started the game as an adult, and then be rewarded the fairy. So. What's your take on all of this, Tony?
Oh, well, yeah, I have a lot of different potential theories on this. Taking another, after listening to it again, because I had read this years ago on Unseen 64, actually had this up, but this is the first time I've actually read it on Nintendo's site, or at least a screenshot of it.
It's another great website that does a lot of digging into beta canceled games and stuff.
So yeah, I mean, obviously when Ocarina of Time first started off, there was no young Link. And that makes sense for this story. And, the thing that I mentioned earlier regarding noting that it was a 256 cartridge was that a lot of people think that Zelda was utilizing, or rather taking, content from the disk drive version of the game and kind of adding it back in. So, this, what we read here, the story was not a disk drive version of the story, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they couldn't have added some of the cut details from the cartridge back in via the disk drive, if that makes sense. It's kind of confusing because you're kind of dealing with a cartridge and a disk, and many different versions. But, on the one hand, you could easily say that, hey, this is kind of complicated. There's a lot of conversations in this and a lot of nuanced things happening. It would be easier just to cut the fat, have it be straightforward, and go from there. Simplify the story so it just makes sense to everybody and it's clean, right? Yeah. So with that could have easily been what they did. Some parts of this are really interesting, like Ganondorf coming after Link.
Yeah, they mentioned it was a monster from the forest took the Deku Tree.
Yeah, and things like putting in the, putting things that you earn into the ocarina, like the sacred stones. That's definitely very interesting content.
And we actually see screenshots of the fairy ocarina with the stones in place. There are a lot of screenshots that I've seen with that.
Yeah. So they were definitely developing this story, with everything that it's mentioning at some point. Now, I will say that when you trick the cartridge into thinking that Ura Zelda is connected and you start a disk file, the game will start up per usual, and then it'll crash when Link starts having his nightmare dream. So it's entirely possible that this additional content that it's talking about regarding Link's coming-of-age story and Ganon's background and this and that required the disc, and maybe they were putting some of that back in. I don't know. It's hard to say, but it's definitely a little bit more convoluted, and it also kind of reminds me of the Link to the Past manual. If you remember that, it has tons of backstory that wasn't in the game itself, and probably was never intended to be in the game. It was just meant for the manual to kind of give a little bit of context for everything. So, speaking of being convoluted, to wrap that point up, I think it could go into one of three different camps. It's just stuff for the manual, or maybe it was for Ura, or it was stuff that was just fat that was cut.
Yeah. So my take on this, which I know during the interview that I had with you about your channel a long time ago, I asked you your thoughts on Ura Zelda, and we talked about, I think I asked you something along the lines of, do you think Ocarina of Time, the standalone game that we have now, is what would have been the original Ocarina of Time, and then Ura would have just added on to it, or do you think there was stuff pulled from the game or changed so that with the Ura expansion having it be the complete game, maybe the game by itself had a few loose ends that kind of needed to be tied up, so they tried working it as best they could as a standalone experience as opposed to having this extra content onto it. So with this, I look at this with, it seems like this would have been the original story with the Ura expansion in mind, and then where it was delayed from the holiday or the winter of 1997 until when it released in 1998. I look at it as in that time they seen the failings of the disk drive and decided instead of releasing Ocarina of Time with the planned expansion, they took this time to change the story around to, as I was asking you about, to make it the best possible standalone experience that it could be, adding in what they wanted from Ura without adding in everything that obviously they possibly couldn't, because the whole point was to have new stories and stuff that couldn't really fit on the cartridge itself. So with this in mind, I feel like they took this, and that year that it was delayed, they tried to slice off all of the fat, as you were saying, that they could to make it the best possible standalone game that they could. But do you think that all of the Ura stuff, like if someone did find a disk drive or like a disk with the Ura expansion on it, do you think you would just be able to like push it in, turn on Ocarina of Time, and it actually work? Or do you think because the game was likely reworked to be a standalone experience, it's no longer compatible? I probably made that a little bit more convoluted or complicated, but
that's a hard question to answer. I do, yeah. So when Ocarina of Time was released, they had in mind what they were doing for the expansion, because all of what they're called are DD hooks, which are basically little things in the code that essentially say, here you connect to the, you hook to the disk drive, right? Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a bunch of those throughout the game, primarily in the dungeons, right? Because you have the Master Quest switch around, right? So I think they already had in mind what they were going to do. I don't think they were necessarily working on an expansion until near the end of development for the cartridge version, because obviously they had to focus on one thing at a time. And you do hear stories about people, the team working on Ura Zelda and then switching away to do Majora's Mask, right? So I do think if you were to find a let's say you would find a blue disc, a DD blue disc, and connect it, it probably would hook in. That said, there could be exceptions to that rule. I mean, maybe there's just a super early version that was incomplete. You also find blue discs that have remnant data, so maybe there's, incomplete code, right, on there. They were working on something, and it isn't, complete enough to be functional, that kind of stuff. So it totally depends. I mean, I think that's a question very loaded with variables, but I do think if you were to have a, quote, complete Ura, it would probably connect.
All right, and what are your thoughts on all of this? Daniel, you've been kind of quiet over there, so
yeah,
from the story, what are your... Like, there's a lot to take in. Yeah, there's a lot to take in. Like, it's the fairy tree. This implies the
there's
Kokiri.
A lot of details that are sort of like, overall I think the story is pretty similar to the finished version of the game, but there's obviously Child Link wasn't in the game yet at this point, and like this was over a year before the game came out, right? And I guess it was supposed to be, I guess it got delayed because it didn't come out till November '98. And this was October '97 when this article was put out.
Well, the update comes from... Like, there's an update to this that says development update October 3rd. So this would have been before October 3rd.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay, so... Yeah. But, so there's a lot that stays kind of similar. You get your fairy from the what's at the time the fairy tree got changed to the Deku tree. The monster that, I guess it says captures the Deku tree, but I guess, you can't really capture a giant tree.
You know what I just thought about? Now, this is a little bit off topic maybe, but on Link's tree, the one that you start out in Ocarina of Time, if you look at the bottom, there's like a beast monster that it shows with a little stick figure trying to fight it. A lot of people assume that could be like Link and Ganon, or that could be like a leftover remnant of the monster, or like a small nod to the monster that would have kidnapped or stolen the Deku tree or the Great Fairy Tree. It just made me think of that really quick, but you can continue.
Yeah, kind of. I was thinking along the same lines of what Tony said about Link to the Past's manual. It talks about also the intro cutscene in A Link to the Past talks about like pretty much describes Ocarina of Time as its sort of backstory. And I think this game, at the time it was being designed, seems to be more designed with A Link to the Past being a prequel to A Link to the Past in mind.
Yeah.
Like
it starts off saying it takes place in the past.
Yeah, and it says, this was before Ganon was Ganon and he was Ganondorf, So it seems like it's really trying to connect itself to A Link to the Past in this way, which, I mean, I always, like, piece that together, that you're watching Link to the Past's backstory, okay, that's clearly, this other game. But, just it says wise men instead of sages and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
Even though most of the sages are actually women, with the exception of Darunia and Roru. But, yeah, I mean, like, this for me is a lot to take in, because I'm not knowledgeable on the subject of, like, beta stuff in Ocarina of Time and the Ura expansion, so for me it's just kind of it's very eye-opening to see this game in this light, like this is a game from my childhood where I like was a young kid playing this game to death. So yeah, it's a lot to take in, man.
At the very
screenshots though.
Yeah, at the very bottom, there at the end, you mentioned screenshots. It shows adult Link going through the Deku Tree. So instead of going through the Deku Tree as Kid Link, the screenshots, it shows like adult Link fighting Queen Goma, going through what looks like Dodongo's Cavern as well. So all of these dungeons, it looks like it was originally designed for adult Link.
Yeah.
And then...
But it looks like he goes through Dodongo's Cavern, but he has the Forced, or I guess at the time, the Wind Medallion. So you kind of have to wonder how much they changed around the dungeon order. If I feel like the Deku Tree was probably still the first dungeon, but maybe you got the medallion instead of the spiritual stone at that point, and then they, ended up changing what its purpose was and introducing a new item that became the spiritual stone, and you have to use it to open the door instead of putting it in the ocarina.
Yeah,
it's
a lot of people's thoughts where it shows, and again I'll have the screenshots up for people watching the video, but it shows the medallions as equipable, which we've seen from a lot of past stuff before this.
Yeah.
A lot of the thought is, say for instance, the fire medallion would, like Din's fire took the place of it. So instead of having the medallions equipable, you would have Din's fire. So instead of having Din's fire as you do now, you would just equip the fire medallion, but it would act similar. And in the same way, some people even thought that maybe that was how you unlocked the different versions of the arrows. You would equip, in the same that in Twilight Princess you can equip the bombs and the arrows at the same time to make the bomb arrows, you would equip the fire medallion with the arrow to make the fire arrow, which is a interesting thought. But aside from these screenshots, there's a developer update that came in October, which would have been a few months, probably a few months after the first update, which says, and at this time it's still referred to as Zelda 64, it says Zelda 64 update. Nintendo Company has released some exciting new screenshots of Zelda 64. One set shows Link riding his horse, and the second set shows a younger Link. This is the first time we see the young Link that Mr. Miyamoto mentioned in a recent interview. Great care is taken to make sure the horse behaves as realistically as possible. You'll have to learn to make it walk or gallop. The horse is not just a quick way for Link to get around. It will also play an integral part in the game, NCL says. What would NCL? Is that the name of a magazine or a different section of Nintendo? Do you guys know? Does that sound familiar, Tony? NCL?
It does not, no. I'm trying to figure that out.
Oh, sorry, it's
Nintendo Company Ltd. Yeah. I think we all realized at the same time. We were all a little bit tired. But yeah, I think that's interesting, because obviously here's this update, but you have to keep in mind regarding thinking or assuming that the previous story could be a part of Ura. If it was, it wouldn't be as that is, because that story that we read is contingent on Link being an adult the entire time.
Yeah.
So it couldn't be Ura. Like, there might have been additional conversations or additional story elements, that kind of thing with Ura, or at least they could have initially intended that.
So do you think
Zelda? But it wouldn't be as is.
Do you think the story changes happened before they started thinking about Ura, or started working on Ura?
I think they were thinking about Ura probably as soon as they knew they had to switch to a cartridge. But I think that when they switched to a cartridge, they were probably trying to nail down the game first. which makes me very, very skeptical that anything we read would be a part of Ura. I mean, it's not that it's impossible, it's just that it's such a embryonic version of the story that it doesn't make sense to be functional with an Ura Zelda. Other thing that I will say real quick, when we're looking at the screenshots and we're talking about the equipable medallions and kind of speculating the order of the dungeons, I totally agree that the dungeons could be out of order, but I will say that these were probably all taken in a sort of a debugging environment. So, for example, if you have the debug ROM of Zelda, or 64, or Majora's Mask, you can load up all of the weapons, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, like with Majora's Mask, you can press a button on the controller and you become Zora Link. So, or you become the Fierce Deity. You can start the game and immediately become Fierce Deity and immediately equip everything. So it doesn't, just because it's equipped, it doesn't necessarily mean that you would normally get those items in that stage of the game or have it by that dungeon. It just means that that's what the developers had equipped.
Yeah. Also,
that's a good point, because also there's screenshots of him fighting Queen Goma as adult Link as well, and he also has what became the Force Medallion equipped. So that's like what is probably always was the first dungeon, just based on even this early version of the story. So I think you got me there.
Yeah, it also shows below the different animations of Link on Epona. There is the first images of Child Link they shown off, and it shows Link what looks like Death Mountain, or close to Goron City, maybe like a beta version of that. And it shows him with the Ocarina of Time. It has that blue tint that the Fairy Ocarina doesn't, and he has the Deku sticks and the screenshot, which infers that he has already completed the Deku tree, but he only has 3 hearts, and he already has a magic meter as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. I find it really interesting that October 3rd is when this update came out. So it wasn't until almost a year before the game came out, which would have been, if we look at the original release date of the winter 1997, this update came in October. That would have only given someone maybe 2 months, or maybe even a month before the game came out, that they would have seen what young Link looked like.
Yeah. I feel like they added him, and that might have been part of why they delayed the game. Like, I wonder if the whole game was sort of that adult Link section, and then they were adding more, or they were moving dungeons around, and they thought to add in young Link, and that caused, or at least played a part in the delay. You have to wonder, because this is so far into or close to the release date for them to just bring this out.
Yeah. The final paragraph on the update, which is the last update that we can see, says, NCL also reveals that Link will mature from boyhood to youth. Some items will only be available to the boy Link. NCL says that teenage Link will occasionally revert to being a boy. However, details of how this mysterious transformation occurs are being kept secret.
This kind of contradicts the old story, though, because here young Link has the fairy, or has Navi, and in the story in the other article it mentions how you get a fairy when you become an adult, right? So
sorry, continue.
So at this point, like, this story that they had in the other article was like probably very much like in flux. Like they made a lot of changes to it at this point, so they probably had a story at this point with young Link much closer to what the final release is. I'm just guessing, of course, but
one thing, and this is slightly off topic, but one thing that I found particularly interesting about the original story was that it was talking about Zelda. Obviously, they mentioned about the same age as you, so like a teenager, as a young woman, right? And already having all of this knowledge, right? So I was just kind of wondering in the back of my mind while you were reading that, like, how would the Zelda character have been different as this sort of matured, knowledgeable familiar with the threat, like how that would have changed in terms of her like guidance of you, you know.
Because in
probably
the
more
actual
similar to
game-
Twilight Princess Zelda. You know, she's very like calm and, you know, very like you can see very mature and like very almost stern as a leader in Twilight Princess. You know.
Yeah, stern and stoic. Yeah.
Yeah, very stoic.
In the story that we got in Ocarina of Time, you get to Zelda, and she says that she's been having visions or dreams of that man Ganondorf taking over. So she kind of suspects something, but she isn't completely sure. Whereas the story in this tells you, as she has the Triforce of Wisdom that we end up knowing, Link has courage, Zelda has wisdom. Maybe it's through her having that wisdom that she's able to learn some of this stuff, and it doesn't necessarily elaborate. But I think what interests me is that in Ocarina of Time that we did get, you start out as being a child, and then you get your fairy. It seems like that aspect of it never changed, of getting the fairy as soon as the game starts. But in the older version, you would have began as an adult. And then you mentioned, why does he have a fairy as a child? Because you get the fairy as a coming of age thing, as it says. My thought is, after you collect the 3 spiritual stones, then you put it in the fairy ocarina to become the Ocarina of Time, possibly, and then once you get the Master Sword or whatever, instead of the way that the game plays out, where you go from being a child to being an adult halfway through the game, in this version you would have started out as an adult, got the fairy as an adult, and then once you got the Ocarina of Time or the 3 spiritual stones and the Master Sword, then you would have transformed back into a child. Maybe the game would have had you traveling back in time in order to stop Ganondorf before he started corrupting Hyrule or whatever. So maybe that was the motivation for why you're able to become young Link, because you have, kind of like Back to the Future, you have to like stop it before it happens, if that makes sense. The videos on this channel are funded by supporters on Patreon like you. If you're a fan of this channel and would like to join on videos, receive shoutouts, watch videos early, have your questions answered, or have your topic discussed on our podcast, please consider supporting on Patreon for these and many other rewards for just $1. Shoutouts for this video includes Link Use the Triforce, Rusty Caulfield, Lovable Christy, Give Time 15, Shadow to Us, Robbie Morgan, and Lunarium. I want to thank all of you for everything you have done to help support this channel.